The pressure alarm shrieked, not a digital siren, but a physical spike driven directly into the auditory nerves, designed to bypass noise dampeners. Jackson Cale did not flinch. The man had endured the dying gasps of far older machinery. He felt the sudden, alarming deceleration through the soles of his worn boots, a jarring counter-force that threatened to crack the spine of the aging command chair. The thick, stale air of the bridge, usually tasting of recycled humidity and machine oil, soured instantly with the acrid tang of ozone, metal protesting extreme magnetic stress. 913 status, Jackson barked, gripping the arms of his console until his knuckles bleached white. The movement was not one of panic, but of ingrained immediate response, a reflex honed over decades of navigating sectors where the only reliable constant was entropy. The AI's projection flickered violently, the small green indicator momentarily replaced by a jagged red slash that signaled critical system failure probability. Captain, immediate deceleration vector calculated at -0.8 GE. External sensors indicate a localized high-intensity gravimetric shear event centered on the approach vector to sector Delta 7. This is not debris, Captain. This is weaponized space. The synthesized voice was perfectly level, yet the sheer volume of data it processed betrayed the crisis. Jackson spat onto the deck plating, a useless gesture, but one that cleared the sudden dryness in his throat. The iron serpent, his only inheritance and his final sanctuary, groaned under the strain, the sound like deep timber fracturing. This was the consequence of the final evacuation order being ignored. Not a clean military engagement, but the chaotic, invisible violence of territorial markers being violently established. He pulled up the external visual feed, compensating for the violent shuddering. Outside the forward viewport, the starfield was not merely warped, it was smeared, pulled into long, agonizing threads of light, as if the fabric of space itself were being drawn taut by unseen, colossal fingers. This was not Qatar's blunt, heavy-handed energy bombardment, nor Ceylan's calculated kinetic strikes. This felt surgical, intelligent, and deeply personal. "Source confirmation, 913, show me the point of origin," Jackson ordered, his voice dropping into the low, resonant register of command, a tone rarely used on a one-man freighter. "Source calculation is complicated, Captain. The shear is propagating from 3 distinct, highly synchronized nodes. They are not firing upon us, Captain. They are establishing boundaries. They are demonstrating scale." The AI paused, the infinitesimal delay a terrifying admission of computational strain. The nodes align precisely with the expected tactical positioning of the Qatar Vanguard, the Ceylan incursion flotilla, and the Vortis perimeter blockade. Jackson felt the familiar cold knot of betrayal tighten beneath his sternum. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that by choosing the last, forgotten delivery, by hugging the periphery, the serpent would be beneath notice. He had calculated that the warlords would be too busy tearing the heart out of Valiska to notice a dying moth fluttering near the rim. He had been wrong. They had seen him. "They are not firing because they are signaling to each other," Jackson murmured, the realization tasting like ash. "They interpret our presence, our very refusal to flee, as a unified message. We are the variable they cannot account for." His mind raced, not with combat strategy, but with the sheer, galling irony. Edric Vaughn, his former commanding officer and mentor, had engineered Jackson's final assignment, this obscure delivery to the Spire, as a quiet exile after the debacle on Cygnus 4, a situation where Jackson had refused to sacrifice a civilian transport convoy to secure a strategic corridor. Vaughn had called it professional insubordination. Jackson had called it necessity. Now, Jackson was trapped in a system-wide standoff initiated by the galaxy's 3 greatest threats, all because they assumed the last functioning human freighter in the sector was a decoy for something grander. 913. Plot an immediate low-power evasive shunt. Destination: immediate proximity of the Viridian Spire debris field. We use the clutter as cover, even if it means a hull breach. Yon. Captain, the debris field is classified as high-risk impact zone. Hull integrity at 78% under current stress load. A direct penetration maneuver carries a 39% chance of catastrophic failure. I know the odds, AI, Jackson snapped. He shifted his weight, the cheap synthetic covering of the command chair peeling slightly under his sudden tension. He could feel the tremor in his left hand, the only physical marker of the lingering psychological trauma from Cygnus 4, a tremor that surfaced only when political power played God with logistics and lives. Vaughn had saved his career by banishing him, and now that exile had delivered him directly into the maw of a cosmic three-way confrontation. The Iron Serpent fought the unseen gravitational snare. Jackson wrestled with the manual thruster controls, overriding the AI's automated attempts to compensate for the weaponized space. He needed chaos, not precision. Precision was predictable. Increase power to forward shielding for 5 seconds. Maximum diversionary output. I want a brief, sharp energy signature bloom on the main sensor arrays. Captain, that will eliminate our current stealth advantage. They will pinpoint our precise vector. They already have the precise vector, 913. They are simply waiting to see which direction we intend to run. I am not running. I am changing the parameters of their observation. Ha! A violent surge rocked the vessel as the shield capacitor dumped energy in a sharp, controlled burst. The ship shuddered, emitting a momentary ghostly glow against the blackness. In that single instant, across the system, the warlords registered the spike. Qatar bellowed, interpreting the spike as a test pattern from an incoming hostile fleet. Cylon tightened her blockade, certain the freighter was leading an ambush force directly into her kill zone. Vortis, interpreting the surge as a precursor to an attempted quantum jump, began to charge his interdiction field. Jackson ignored the noise. The moment the energy signature dissipated, he slammed the reverse thrusters, not the main drive, but the aging maneuvering jets, forcing the Serpent E into a violent, uncontrolled spin, using the centrifugal force to throw the ship off the immediate line of the gravimetric shear. The maneuver was crude, bordering on suicidal. Gravimetric stress decreasing, 913 reported immediately, the tension in its voice slightly lessened. We have slipped the initial boundary layer, Captain. They will be adjusting their field synchronization momentarily. We have an estimated window of 60 standard seconds before they recalibrate. 60 seconds. 60 seconds to reach a place where the warlords' weapons were rendered useless by the sheer density of abandoned metal, the grave marker of Valiska's failed colonial ambition. Jackson saw the spectral outline of the decaying orbital ring ahead, a jagged halo of wreckage. 913, prepare the external deployment clamps. We are going in hot. As the Iron Serpent pitched violently toward the lethal wreckage, a single unexpected burst of high-frequency, high-band transmission sliced through the static, overriding the AI's basic filter protocols. It was a structured signal, impossibly complex, utilizing mathematical constants that had been obsolete for 3 centuries. Captain, incoming data stream, unfiltered. Origin, Vortis flagship. Decoding suggests a formalized diplomatic query. The message repeats a single concept, Captain. It is not a threat. Jackson squinted at the translated fragment flashing across a secondary monitor, his breath catching in his chest. He recognized the archaic root structure of the language. It was the formal diplomatic cipher used by the nascent Galactic Council centuries before the current powers tore the structure apart. The message read, "We acknowledge receipt of the recognized emissary. State your mandate. We await your counsel regarding the cessation of hostilities." Jackson stared at the screen, the ozone smell still sharp in his lungs. the reality of the threat suddenly shifting from physical danger to existential collapse. The warlords did not see a mere freighter, they saw a ghost from a unified past, a messenger bearing authority they had spent generations dismantling. And he, Jackson Cale, the disgraced pilot sent on a fool's errand to deliver life support to a dead station, was now, by cosmic accident, the recognized emissary of a government that no longer existed. He was holding a peace treaty that no one alive remembered how to sign. The wreckage was rushing toward them, and the terrible weight of an authority he never wanted, never earned, settled upon his shoulders like the crushing weight of an entire dead civilization. The abrupt silence that followed the garbled diplomatic query was worse than the shriek of the alarms. The gravimetric shear eased, but the bridge did not settle. The iron serpent was still tumbling, a dying body convulsing from the violent override. Jackson's left hand clenched around the auxiliary control yoke, the tremor now a noticeable, persistent vibration against the worn metal. He squeezed his eyes shut, tasting the dryness of fear layered over the stale recycled air. Vaughn's banishment, the Cygnus 4 incident, it was never about the convoy's lives. It was about control, about eliminating variables that dared to place ethics above strategic necessity. 913. Abort the shunt maneuver. Reroute all available auxiliary power to stabilizing gyroscopes. I want us facing the debris field dead center in 10 seconds. Jackson forced the words out, his throat tight. The weight of the title, emissary, was instantly heavier than the ship's stressed superstructure. He was no ambassador. He was a mechanic who refused to let a critical valve blow. Acknowledged, Captain. Rerouting power. Gyro stabilization commencing. Estimated time to nominal orientation, 8.7 seconds. The ship lurched one final sickening time as the internal compensators fought the angular momentum. Jackson stared at the external monitor, the view resolving from smeared light into razor-sharp shards of ancient, radiation-scarred metal, the debris of the failed Villisca Colonial Defense Initiative. This field was the consequence of the last time sentient life tried to govern itself here, a graveyard of misplaced faith in centralized command. Captain, the AI's voice cut through the settling whine of the restored systems. The warlords are responding to the Vortis signal relay. They are interpreting the emissary declaration as a coordinated pre-invasion signal from a previously unknown Council remnant faction. Qatar's flagship is disengaging its peripheral screening ships. Cylon is deploying her primary kinetic batteries. Vortis is dropping his interdiction net. Jackson felt a cold sweat bloom on his back despite the chill of the bridge. He hadn't bought time. He had accelerated the timeline. His attempt at evasion, interpreted as a diplomatic overture, had catalyzed the very conflict he sought to avoid. He was not an observer. He was the detonator. Cancel stabilization. Reroute all remaining shield power to external broadcast array. Maximum output. I need to send a counter signal. Something absolute. Something that overrides their current readings. Captain, that will leave the hull completely exposed to the gravimetric boundaries they are re-establishing, and transmitting on that frequency will register as an immediate, hostile declaration of intent to all three warlords simultaneously. Precisely, Jackson ground out, slamming his palm against the console where the Vortis cipher still glowed green. If I am the emissary, I must immediately renounce the credentials they mistakenly assigned me. If I am silent, they kill each other believing they have won a grand political victory. If I shout denial, they will simply classify me as a rogue agent attempting to sabotage their alliances. He remembered Vaughn's icy calm during the Cygnus 4 debriefing, detailing the necessary sacrifice of 3,000 civilian lives for the tactical advantage of one blockade runner. Sometimes, Cale, the truth is less useful than a believable lie. Vaughn had stated, cleaning his uniform insignia with meticulous focus. Jackson now understood the bitter core of that philosophy. What is the highest yield, most universally recognized signal of surrender or non-aggression, Known to the Historical Council archives, 913? Forget protocol. Give me the raw, undeniable signature of absolute impotence. The AI word, the processors struggling to find an answer outside the parameters of modern military exchange. The most universally recognized, low-complexity signal indicating immediate cessation of all command intent dates back to the early Xylos Accords. It requires overloading a primary external communication dish with raw, unfiltered power until structural failure, broadcasting only the ship's unique registry ID in an endless loop. Do it! Target the main communications spine. Burn it out! As the power surged toward the dish, the internal lighting of the Iron Serpent dimmed catastrophically, plunging the bridge into near darkness, illuminated only by the sickly green emergency strobes and the angry red warnings flashing across the diagnostics panel. The ship vibrated not from external force, but from the internal sacrifice of its own systems. The transmission began, a harsh, screaming burst of static containing nothing but the freighter's designation, repeating on a loop that sounded like a dying bird caught in machinery. It was the digital equivalent of standing naked in the center of the battlefield and screaming one's own name until the voice box ruptured. For a critical span of 3 full seconds, the warlords paused. Qatar's energy batteries stopped charging. Cylon's kinetic slugs froze inches from their firing solution. Vortis halted the final tightening of his interdiction field. They were watching a vessel willingly commit system suicide rather than engage in their political chess. Then, the sacrifice triggered the opposite reaction. Captain, sensor readings shifting rapidly. Qatar is re-engaging his vanguard. He interprets the transmission burnout as a forced self-destruct sequence, a planned detonation to wipe out sensitive data before capture. He is moving to secure the wreckage before detonation. And Cylon, Jackson gasped, wiping the sudden oil leak from a secondary coolant line that had ruptured near his console. Cylon is deploying boarding drones toward the wreckage, Captain. She assumes the freighter carries an invaluable biological or strategic asset that you are attempting to destroy rather than surrender. Jackson looked out at the debris field, no longer seeing useless metal, but a crowded, contested airspace. His deliberate signal of impotence had been read as a tactical finale, a desperate last act guaranteeing that the prize, whatever the warlords imagined the Serpent carried, would be contested violently in the very immediate wreckage zone. 913, the delivery, Jackson managed, ignoring the screaming internal integrity alarms. The module. We have to get the module off the ship. Captain, the deployment clamps are locked due to the power redistribution across the communication spine. Furthermore, the external environment is now classified as an active combat theater. Hull exposure probability, 100%. Jackson pushed himself from the command chair, his legs protesting the abrupt shift in gravitational demand. The tremor in his left hand was now a full-arm spasm, a physical echo of the moment. He realized his refusal to fight on Cygnus 4 had not saved lives, but merely postponed the order to be executed by someone else. He staggered toward the emergency manual override access port near the rear bulkhead. I am not waiting for authorization from a dying council. I am not a diplomat. I am a delivery man, Jackson growled, pulling the heavy access plate open, revealing the sparking junction box behind it. 913, bypass safety protocols. Overload the secondary magnetic couplings directly. I will eject the cargo module manually. If the warlords want something, they will have to pry it out of the graveyard we are flying into. He reached into the sparking junction, the air immediately growing sharp with the scent of burning insulation, ignoring the shock that threatened to seize his arm. He needed to sever the umbilical connection to make the Iron Serpent a decoy worth less than the single hydroponic unit he carried. As his fingers found the thick insulated cable meant to handle the main cargo release, the tactical overlay flashed a horrifying new development. A single fast-moving, needle-thin vessel, identified as a Cylon rapid insertion craft, had detached from the main flotilla and was accelerating directly toward the Serpent's rear cargo bay. "Captain, rapid ingress detected. Cylon forces closing fast. They anticipate the cargo drop and are moving to intercept the module mid-trajectory." Jackson yanked the cable free with a roar of exertion, sparks showering his face and singeing the edge of his worn flight jacket. Outside, the single vital hydroponic module tore free from the docking clamps, falling away from the Iron Serpent and plunging into the dark heart of the weaponized debris field, carrying a single silent promise of future life toward the three entities now fighting to claim its ashes. The detachment initiated a violent rebound shock that slammed Jackson against the bulkhead, the raw smell of ozone momentarily replaced by the coppery scent of fresh blood where his temple connected with the sharp edge of a coolant pipe. He slid down the access panel, his vision swimming in streaks of emerald green from the emergency lights and angry crimson from the diagnostic alerts. The Iron Serpent was now officially crippled, its primary communications destroyed, its cargo jettisoned into the kill zone. "Module trajectory confirmed, Captain," 913 announced, its voice now possessing a clipped urgency that suggested even the non-biological entity recognized the shift to pure ugly survival. "The Cylon insertion craft is converging on the module's predicted descent vector at 93% of maximum thrust. Qatar's Vanguard is maintaining a holding pattern above the main wreckage cluster, awaiting your detonation." Jackson pushed himself upright, ignoring the sharp, throbbing pain behind his eyes. The heat in the aft section of the ship was rising rapidly. The severed power conduit he had manipulated was now venting superheated vapor, creating a localized thermal pocket that smelled distinctly of melting polymer and desperation. His simple goal, deliver a seed pod, had become the gravitational center of a localized galactic war. 913, initiate emergency ballast dump into the main engine manifold. I need a directional counterthrust, however brief. We are abandoning this sector, even if we burn out the remaining reactor cores. Ballast dumping will equalize localized pressure, Captain, but it will also render the primary maneuverability thrusters inert. We will be relying solely on the single tertiary cold gas verniers for the next hour. Hull integrity projections drop below critical failure threshold within 10 minutes due to sustained structural stress. It was the choice Vaughn had always forced upon him: sacrifice the ship's ability to steer or sacrifice the immediate chance of escape. Jackson braced himself against the vibrating deck plates, the floor now radiating a low, dangerous warmth through the soles of his boots. He tasted the sweat stinging his eyes. It was thin, salty, and carried the flavor of burnt lubricants. We cannot steer if we are captured, AI. We can barely survive if we run. Execute the dump, make us heavy and hard to stop, but move us away from the direct line of fire. The ship groaned as tons of inert ballast material were jettisoned. The brief, sickening lurch of the redistribution of mass nearly sent Jackson sprawling again. Outside, the Cylon insertion craft, spotting the momentary shift in the Serpent's trajectory, assumed Jackson was attempting a blind jump and deployed a localized jamming field, shrouding the freighter in electronic noise that even the AI struggled to penetrate. "Captain, localized interference is severe. I am receiving spurious internal diagnostics. My processing core is reporting phantom code injections, high-level encryption fragments originating from the Vortis blockade perimeter. It appears they are attempting to brute force access to our navigation logs, believing the emissary signal was a data transfer key. Torspur." This was the insidious nature of the political war. Even when physically battered, the system was still attempting to dissect him piece by piece. Jackson felt a profound, aching exhaustion. He needed clean air and 30 standard hours to patch the core damage, but he had less than 10 minutes of breathable atmosphere before the cumulative system failures began venting the environmental reserves. Filter the Vortis intrusion attempts. Divert all non-essential life support power, heat regulation, atmospheric recycling scrubbers, directly into the auxiliary field emitters. We are going to generate a static bubble around the bridge section. Make it ugly, make it loud, but keep the air moving inside. The cabin temperature spiked immediately. The air grew thick, heavy with the sharp, mineral tang of stressed electrical fields and the trapped humidity of his own labored breathing. He felt the metallic ache in his chest deepen, the familiar precursor to hypoxia beginning its slow, insidious creep. Power rerouted, Captain. Bridge atmospheric integrity maintained at minimum viable levels. However, the environmental degradation will accelerate the structural failure rate. We have less than 7 minutes before hull breaches become inevitable outside this SEAL section. Jackson moved back to the command chair, his movement stiff, almost deliberate. He had to analyze the new threat, the silent insertion craft closing in on the cargo. He forced his eyes to focus on the tactical display, fighting the blurring spots in his vision. 913. Project the projected impact vector for the Iron Serpent. If we use the remaining verniers to attempt a direct intercept trajectory with the silent craft. Forget the debris. We need to hit that drone before it scoops the module. Nearer. Calculating intercept probability against a fully functional silent insertion craft while operating on tertiary verniers and compromised sensor resolution. Probability of successful intercept 1.4%. Probability of both vessels being instantly destroyed upon contact 92%. A cold, rational thought surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. The module was already lost. The warlords were fighting over a ghost. Saving his ship, even crippled, was the only way to escape the system and live to deliver a real message one day. But the image of that tiny green light, the one point of nascent life he had managed to plant in the rot of Viridian Spire, held him fast. Cale's folly, he muttered, recognizing the pattern of his own catastrophic stubbornness. Vaughn would have atomized the ship instantly to preserve his own existence. Jackson, trapped by a misplaced sense of duty, was ensuring that even in death he would be a nuisance. He engaged the verniers. The Iron Serpent shuddered, not with controlled power, but with the erratic sputtering of starved machinery. It was a painful, slow correction, like a dying leviathan attempting to roll over. The movement was just enough to put them on a collision course with the silent drone, which was now locked onto the falling module. Captain, the drone has secured the module. Its retrieval clamps are engaged. It is beginning evasive maneuvers to return to the silent flagship. Satabai. The sight relayed through the battered forward sensors was infuriatingly anticlimactic. A sleek predator gently cradling a small green glowing box. We are too slow to intercept, 913. Adjust trajectory. Target the drone's primary stabilization fins. We don't need to destroy it. We just need to send it spinning back into the wreckage field. Adjusting trajectory. Preparing for final system burnout. The AI sounded resigned. Jackson braced himself, the thin air now thick enough to chew. He felt the familiar painful burn in his lungs, the price of pushing machinery past its designed limits. He focused on the enemy drone, watching its vector shift slightly as it sensed the closing, sputtering mass of the Iron Serpent. The moment the targeting solution aligned, the tactical display overloaded entirely, not from external interference this time, but from an internal cascade failure caused by the power diversion to the emitters. The bridge went utterly dark, save for the faint organic green glow reflecting off the emergency strobes, turning the cabin into a deep-sea cavern. "Status! 913!" Jackson roared, though his voice was already a strained whisper. A moment of absolute, terrifying void. Then a single synthetic tone, a clean high-frequency chime, cut through the darkness. "External power failure complete, Captain. Primary and secondary emitters offline. Bridge atmosphere recycling has ceased entirely. We are on battery reserve. However, the AI's voice returned, sounding suddenly clearer, closer, perhaps because the filtering systems were now dead, or the sudden power drop initiated a fail-safe protocol linked to the main reactor cooling loops. An emergency backup shunt designed for deep core repairs has briefly engaged. What does that mean, AI? Jackson fought for breath, every inhalation a conscious effort. It means, Captain, that for the next 45 seconds the main reactor output is being channeled into the inertial dampeners. Bypassing all safety limiters, it will not move the ship forward, but it will momentarily stabilize the internal gravity field against external pressures. 45 seconds of stability in exchange for guaranteed catastrophic power loss afterward. It was a final desperate throw of the dice. Use it, 913. Target the silent craft now. Full inertial dampening output into a kinetic pulse against their propulsion array. We are going to trade our last second of stability for their last second of control. The ship, held rigid by an impossible surge of power fighting against its own structural integrity, held steady for one perfect microsecond. A focused, invisible wave of force slammed into the silent insertion craft. The tactical overlay flashed. Propulsion array compromised. The drone shrieked an electronic death cry as it tumbled helplessly away from the hydroponic module, spinning wildly toward the densest part of the Villisca ruins. The 45 seconds ended with a deafening internal thud as the dampeners instantly failed, throwing Jackson violently against the restraints of his command chair, knocking the remaining air from his lungs. Darkness enveloped him again, absolute and suffocating. Then, a new sound. Not the grinding of Qatar's heavier ships, nor the electronic whine of Cylon's drones. This sound was rhythmic, deep, and profoundly alien. It was a low-frequency resonance that vibrated in the marrow of Jackson's bones, a sound that suggested immense, patient mass displacing stellar matter. 913, report, Jackson wheezed, pressing his face against the cool metal of the armrest, clawing for air. The AI's response was slow, filtered through dying reserve power, and devoid of its usual analytical precision. It sounded for the first time truly afraid. Captain, the impact of the collision forced the Cylon drone into the Vortis perimeter cluster. The resulting debris cloud, it triggered Vortis's interdiction field prematurely. The energy backlash. It has agitated the deep space anomaly we detected earlier. Jackson could feel the tremor again, but this was too heavy, too slow for weaponry. The anomaly, Captain, the gravitational signatures are resolving. It is not an anomaly. It is a ship. It is massive. It is running silent drive signatures, and it is emerging from the deep void, directly toward the wreckage field where the cargo module currently rests. The low resonance intensified, a sound that felt less like noise and more like the universe rearranging itself around an older, greater power. Jackson fought through the hypoxia, his vision clearing just enough to see a single, massive outline resolving on the dead view screen, a silhouette so vast it seemed to blot out the background stars. It was not a warlords vessel. It was something built for distances and durations that made the current conflict seem like a child's squabble over sand. And it was coming for the one thing that Jackson Cale had managed to deposit into the chaos, the seed of life. The heavy subsonic pulse of the approaching vessel permeated the dead air of the bridge, bypassing the defunct environmental systems and vibrating directly against the deep-seated structure of Jackson's bones. The scent of ozone and burnt plastic, the familiar musk of a dying ship, was overwritten by a sterile, freezing cold that seemed to leach the remaining warmth from his body. This was not the heat of combat. It was the profound, unsettling chill of deep, unhurried transit. Jackson forced his gaze from the monstrous shape on the screen, a shape so large it seemed less like a vessel and more like a mobile fragment of a dead moon, to the emergency auxiliary monitor, the only screen still flickering on residual battery power. He needed to know what the Vortis interdiction field had truly unleashed. 913, Jackson whispered, the effort searing his throat. Access the restricted internal logs from the Vortis intrusion attempt. Filter for the encryption fragments. Find the file they were attempting to access before we overloaded the array. There was a significant delay. The AI was running on a sliver of power, its synthetic voice thin, stretched across the dying circuitry. Captain, access granted to tertiary log sectors. The Vortis attempts were sophisticated, utilizing recursive decryption keys. They breached the outer firewall of our historical archive system. Cross-referencing, I have isolated the target file fragment. It is not logistical data, Captain. It appears to be a data shard recovered from the original colonization probes sent centuries ago. The pressure of the mysterious Leviathan outside was mounting, the hull creaking in protest, a sound of structural surrender that Jackson knew he could not long ignore. He was trapped in a dead bridge, breathing air that was becoming fatally thin, waiting for data that might explain why he was about to be incinerated by something far larger than the warlords. Display the fragment 913, full visual overlay, low resolution. The auxiliary screen flooded with static, then resolved into an image, a heavily processed geological scan of the Velisca system's core, dated pre-contact. It showed the rich, untouched mineral veins the warlords were fighting over. But overlaid on this map, hidden beneath layers of political obfuscation Jackson had seen 1,000 times, was a secondary glowing overlay. It was not a resource designation, it was a quarantine marker. That spectral band, Jackson breathed, recognizing the ancient regulatory code he had studied in his early academy days, codes designed to seal away biological threats, not claim mining rights. 913, what is the designation of that quarantine marker? The AI processed the symbol, its voice cracking slightly under the load. The marker designation is designated K7 Omega. Captain, K7 Omega is a level 5 biohazard sequestration marker. It denotes a threat that cannot be mitigated by standard kinetic or energy weaponry. It means the planetary bodies within this sector were deemed lethally contaminated, abandoned by the original Council Expeditionary Force. The realization struck Jackson with the force of a direct plasma hit. The warlords were not fighting over wealth. They were fighting over the remnants of a quarantine zone, a forbidden prize. Qatar's expansionism, silent strategy, Vortis's paranoia, all stemmed from the foundational, lethal lie that the core worlds were worth conquering. The Velisca system was not a treasure trove, it was a galactic septic tank sealed off centuries ago, and he, in his stubborn adherence to a delivery promise, had just unwittingly forced the quarantine breach wide open by driving the Cylon drone into the Vortis interdiction field, alerting the entity that maintained the quarantine. The massive ship emerging from the void was not a warlord, it was the jailer. "The Module 913, Jackson rasped, the pain in his chest momentarily forgotten in the face of this institutional betrayal. The hydroponic module. What was its true purpose if the core was contaminated? Cross-referencing the delivery manifest against the archival data recovered from the Vortis probe. Captain, the manifest is falsified. The module designated Hydroponic Growth Unit. It is registered under the protocol designation Containment Vessel Alpha 7. It is not carrying seeds. It is carrying a stabilized, viable sample of the K7 Omega contaminant. Jackson felt the cold wash of true horror. Edric Vaughn, his old commander, had not exiled him to a quiet corner. He had used Jackson as a desperate, disposable courier to deliver the very contagion the galaxy was built upon keeping contained. Vaughn's faction, the remnants of the Council's pragmatic hardliners, hadn't wanted the warlords to destroy each other. They wanted the warlords to be the first vector of infection, destroying the political opposition while ensuring the plague remained locked within the system's gravitational influence, until a suitable contingency could be enacted. Jackson wasn't delivering hope. He was delivering the ultimate political weapon. The colossal vessel outside registered the module's location, its energy signature now focusing like a lens. It was preparing to cleanse the entire sector, contaminant and warlords alike. Jackson was faced with the impossible ethical crossroads. The air was almost gone. The reserves were critical. He had two choices, both damning. Option 1. Abandon ship immediately. Activate the one remaining. Small, single-person escape pod, a relic designed for emergency ejection only. It had enough life support for a meager jump out of system, sacrificing the Iron Serpent and any chance of warning anyone about the contamination or Vaughn's scheme. He would survive, but the secret would die with his ship, and the contamination would fester until the warlords inevitably reached the module. Option 2. Remain. Use the last dregs of power to override the core cooling shunt one last time, not for a kinetic pulse, but to power up the emergency beacon array, the one system that had survived the initial bombardment, designed to broadcast a low-frequency distress signal outside the blockade zone. It would consume the last energy reserves, venting atmosphere instantly, guaranteeing his death within seconds. But the signal, though weak, might reach a neutral zone before the jailer ship sterilized the system. It would expose Vaughn's complicity, but at the cost of his own life, and the module would still be retrieved by the colossal quarantine vessel. He looked at the faint green glow emanating from the auxiliary display, the color of the life he had tried to plant, now the color of the death he had delivered. Vaughn's words echoed. Sometimes the truth is less useful than a believable lie. His survival, his escape, would be the final, clean lie. Jackson reached out, his fingers trembling violently from the hypoxia, not toward the escape pod release, but toward the main beacon override junction box, the one he had deliberately bypassed when installing the external emitters. He jammed his scorched hand into the sparking cavity, ignoring the fresh electrical burns searing his skin. 913, he gasped, his voice a dry rattle. Forget the navigation logs. Override all remaining power reserves, life support, environmental controls, everything, into the emergency subspace beacon. Target frequency, neutral sector Delta 9, broadcast a repeating unfiltered data packet, Vaughn's encryption fragments, and the K7 Omega designation, full burn. Ponder. Captain, atmospheric integrity failure in 3.2 seconds. Lethal hypoxia. Imminent. The AI's voice was startlingly clear in the sudden silence of dead power. This action guarantees immediate system shutdown and critical hull failure within 9 seconds. Then make those 9 seconds count. 913, Jackson forced out, pulling the primary conduit free, severing the last electrical connection to the life support systems. The air left the bridge instantly, sucked out into the void by the internal pressure differential of the dying ship. Jackson felt the instantaneous, agonizing suction in his lungs. The green glow of the auxiliary screen intensified one last time, not with a soft pulse, but with a fierce, desperate flare, the final scream of a dying transmission tearing its way through the fabric of known space. The massive, silent vessel outside, sensing the sudden surge of unauthorized broadcast energy, reacted, not with measured diplomacy or strategic maneuvering, but with overwhelming, immediate force. A single, colossal beam of energy, impossibly focused and utterly silent, lanced out from the Leviathan's core, slicing through the void toward the weakened Iron Serpent. It struck the bridge section with the impersonal finality of a closing vault door, vaporizing Jackson Cale and his crippled ship into an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. The signal, the truth of the quarantine, already trailing its faint, desperate echo into the cold, uncaring dark. When the incandescent white dissolved, it was not into darkness, but into a profound, aching pressure. Jackson was not dead. He was not vaporized. The jailer ship, the entity of immense gravity and chilling purpose, had executed its sterilization protocol not by immediate annihilation, but by localized stasis field deployment around the freighter's bridge module. The containment ship had prioritized securing the source of the broadcast, the data, over the immediate destruction of the source, Jackson. The command chair, though warped and buckled, held his ruined frame in place. The air recycler was silent, dead, its vacuum effect countered by the external stasis field which, ironically, held the residual poisonous atmosphere of the dying ship in a tight, stagnant envelope around him. Jackson could not breathe. He could only feel the heavy, crushing weight of the system's artificial gravity field pressing him into the plasti-steel. Every millimeter of his body screamed in protest, a symphony of ruptured capillaries and stressed bone. The last flicker of the auxiliary screen was gone. Only the oppressive sterile cold remained, leaching the heat from his core. He was suspended in a pocket of inescapable failure. 913 was gone. The AI, requiring massive power to maintain any semblance of computational function, had been extinguished by the final complete drain into the subspace beacon. Jackson was utterly alone, entombed in the metallic wreckage of the Iron Serpent, drifting silently within the perimeter of an enemy that did not understand politics, only contagion. He tried to move his left hand, the one that had pulled the conduit, but it was leaden, unresponsive. The electrical burns had fused nerves, and the physical shock was compounded by the crushing atmospheric pressure held artificially in place. He focused on the one sense that remained operational, sound, or rather, the interpretation of vibrations transmitted through the chair frame. The low, resonant thrumming of the jailer vessel continued, slower now, more methodical. It was scanning, mapping the wreckage, confirming the successful isolation of the K7 Omega data spike. The warlords, Qatar, Cylon, and Vortis, were irrelevant now. Their petty war had been terminated by the arrival of the true authority. Jackson did not feel rage. Rage required energy he no longer possessed. He felt only the dead weight of realization. Vaughn had not just betrayed him. Vaughn had used him as a bait and switch, a disposable martyr to expose the hidden quarantine to the warlords, ensuring the destruction of all three factions by drawing out the Council's cleanup crew. Jackson's desperate final act, broadcasting the truth, had not saved the system. It had merely confirmed the jurisdiction of the jailers. He had traded his life for a footnote in an ancient security log. He tried to force his eyes open again, to see the external readouts, but his eyelids were too heavy, swollen shut by the pressure differential. He was blind, suffocating, and immobilized. This was not the dramatic final stand depicted in Academy Hollows. This was the slow, grinding degradation of equipment failure and physiological collapse, the reality of hard science applied without mercy. Then, a new vibration, sharp, localized, and terribly close. It was not the deep cosmic thrum of the jailer ship, but a focused, mechanical resonance, hitting the outer hull just meters from his entombed command station. It sounded like precision drilling. The jailer vessel had stabilized the wreckage field. It was now performing retrieval, not sterilization. It was hunting the only physical asset of value remaining, containment vessel Alpha 7, but the drill was hitting the wrong section. Jackson remembered the schematics of the Iron Serpent's segregated sections, a point of pride for its ancient design. The primary cargo bay was forward, but the aft section, where he had jettisoned the emergency ballast, housed the auxiliary power core access panel. This panel was shielded by a layer of antiquated, non-standardized ferroceramic plating that his own engineering team had installed years ago, circumventing standard regulatory mandates to reduce mass. It was an illegal modification, a flaw that the warlords' standard scanning arrays would have simply dismissed as clutter. The jailer ship's retrieval drone, or perhaps The main vessel itself, utilizing micro-manipulators, was attempting to bore through the standard hull plating around the primary cargo lock, expecting to find the module there, based on the last telemetry spike from the Cylon drone. They were wasting time, energy, and attention on the wrong vector. This tiny structural anomaly, his own illegal act of cutting weight, had created a blind spot in the grand cosmic surveillance. If the drone drilled through that illegal plating, it would reach the reactor core access junction, the very junction Jackson had scorched to power the beacon. That junction was now cold, inert, and filled with corrosive coolant vapor. A breach there would expose the reactor housing directly to the external stasis field, creating a massive, localized energy imbalance. It was a chance, not of escape, but of momentary disruption. If he could trigger the core's automatic shutdown sequence, a fail-safe designed to flood the reactor chamber with inert gas upon hull breach, the sudden expulsion of superheated material, even inert gas, into the external stasis field might overload the jailer's localized containment bubble. It would not destroy the colossal ship, but it might momentarily dissolve the pressure field holding Jackson captive, buying him 3 seconds of oxygen, perhaps 5. 5 seconds was the difference between remaining a corpse in a frozen tomb or a dead man in motion. His fingers still wouldn't obey. He focused every ounce of residual will, every desperate memory of the taste of clean air into the spasming left arm. He ignored the searing pain of his own burned flesh, focusing only on the rhythmic vibration of the drill biting into the ferro-ceramic layer just a few meters away. He was visualizing the connection, feeling the arc of the power conduit that led from the main console relays to that secondary junction box. He strained, the effort pulling a silent internal scream from his chest. The movement was agonizingly slow. A muscle twitch, then a slight grinding sound as his elbow scraped across the damaged console housing, 1 millimeter, then another. The drilling sound abruptly stopped. A new vibration replaced it, the high-frequency whine of an internal cutting beam, preparing to slice through the final barrier. 913. Status. Jackson managed, the word catching in his throat, a meaningless whisper in the dead air. No response, only the internal whine of the cutting mechanism accelerating. He focused all remaining synaptic energy into his index finger, aiming for the junction relay near his right hand, the one that controlled the auxiliary diagnostic projector, a tool useless now, but still wired into the central energy bus. He couldn't move the arm, but perhaps, if the physical contact point was already compromised by burn damage, a final, desperate muscle contraction, a biological short circuit, could send a single spike of phantom energy across the bus. His finger twitched, striking the console panel next to the dead projector housing. A single, unexpected response erupted from the dead systems, a cascade failure alarm. It was not an external drone signal, but the Iron Serpent's own internal, long-dormant fire suppression sequence for the reactor core, triggered by the minuscule electrical discharge from his finger. The reactor chamber was flooding. A deep grinding sound resonated through the hull as the safety clamps released. The external cutting beam ceased instantly. The jailer vessel recognized the rapid, uncontrolled pressure change. It had found the critical weak point. Before the massive quarantine ship could readjust its containment field, Jackson felt the hull groan one final terrible time. The heavy ferro-ceramic plating buckled inward from the pressure differential, and the inert gas, superheated by the reactor's final dying surge, exploded outward into the freezing vacuum of the stasis field. The field shattered outward in a violent, contained shockwave of hot vapor. Jackson Cale was violently ejected from the wreckage of the bridge, propelled outward by the dying expulsion of his own ship's core, a tiny broken shard of organic matter thrown into the unforgiving vacuum, directly toward the colossal looming silhouette of the quarantine enforcement vessel. His final agonizing awareness was the sensation of cold rushing in, and the horrifying clear sight of the massive hull rushing up to meet him, not as an enemy vessel, but as the indifferent final boundary of his universe. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The shattering was immediate, not a gradual decompression, but a catastrophic structural failure localized entirely by the uncontrolled release of pressure from the auxiliary core. The external stasis field, designed to hold breathable atmosphere against inert metal, screamed as the sudden injection of superheated inert purge gas overloaded its dampening coils. For one glorious, agonizing fraction of a second, the pressure holding Jackson against the command chair vanished. His body, already screaming from the microfractures induced by the prior gravimetric shear, bucked violently, freed from its constraint. He did not think about the data beacon he had activated, nor the promise he had kept. He thought only of the physical necessity of momentum transfer. His left arm, miraculously, responded to the absolute threat of vaporization by pulling taut against the ruined console, using the last vestige of his pectoral strength. He launched himself laterally, not away from the jailer ship, but perpendicular to its main axis, using the exploding remnants of the Iron Serpent's aft section as a crude propellant. The ejection sent him tumbling into the void, a broken satellite orbiting a leviathan. The stasis field collapsed with a silent electromagnetic ripple, and the cold of absolute vacuum immediately slammed into his exposed skin, freezing the vapor trails of his final exhalation instantly. He was aware of the pain not as a sensation, but as a massive, unavoidable data stream confirming irreparable tissue damage. His eyes, still swollen and cracked from the internal pressure, registered the immediate, terrifying sight of the quarantine vessel. It dwarfed any concept of a warship. It was an industrial construct, a moving citadel built purely for systemic quarantine enforcement, its surface dull, non-reflective plasteel, absorbing all ambient light. It was the embodiment of absolute bureaucratic finality. The jailer ship's response to the localized explosion was swift, mechanical, and utterly without malice. It did not fire weapons. It deployed retrieval mechanisms. 3 sleek, needle-thin drones detached from the main hull, their multi-jointed manipulators already extending. They were not seeking to destroy Jackson, the organic residue. They were seeking the data signature he had been carrying, now scattered across the debris field, and they were treating his body as a contaminant that needed sterile containment. Jackson tumbled, completely disoriented, the solar glare of the distant Villisca star catching the shattered remnants of his cockpit glass, flashing like dying embers. He saw one drone adjust its trajectory, closing on the largest section of the Serpent. The command module he had just abandoned. It was moving to secure the black box, the final record of the K7 Omega transmission. He had to delay it. The data was his insurance policy, a desperate failsafe Vaughn had never accounted for. If the warlords could not get the data, they could not easily trace the breach back to the established military channels. He forced his right hand, the one that had struck the panel, to engage the emergency magnetic shear clamp built into his flight harness, a relic from his day's running supplies through high radiation zones. He slammed the activation stud. The clamp engaged with a sickening, grinding thunk against a piece of hull plating that had been ripped free during his ejection. The tether, a thin strand of molecularly reinforced polymer, instantly pulled taut, yanking him violently to a stop, arresting his momentum relative to the debris cloud. The sudden deceleration felt like being struck by a railgun slug, but it bought him precious time. The drone heading for the bridge module hesitated, its sensors registering a secondary moving mass. Jackson. It split its focus, sending one manipulator toward him while the other continued toward the main wreckage. Jackson knew he could not outrun them. His only asset was the environment itself, the toxic legacy of Villisca. He reached for the only operational piece of equipment still physically connected to him, a heavy-duty maintenance torch magnetically locked to his thigh plating. It was designed for cutting through dense alloys, not for combat. He activated the torch. A needle-thin beam of incandescent blue-white energy shot forth. He did not aim for the drone. He aimed for the material directly beneath it. He sliced a short, shallow furrow into a piece of derelict engine housing, heating the metal to its point of molecular instability in under a second. The metal did not vaporize. It sagged, warped, and then violently fractured under the residual stress of the stasis field's collapse. The drone, reading the sudden structural integrity failure, aborted its grasp on the fragment and pivoted toward Jackson, its manipulator arms snapping open into grappling claws. Mandate violation detected. Organic containment required. A synthesized voice, cold and utterly devoid of regional accent, stated from the drone's emitter. It was the voice of pure regulation. Jackson didn't reply. He didn't have time for the philosophical debate Vaughn had engineered. He ignited the torch again, not targeting the drone, but the tether connecting him to the engine fragment. The polymer strand, designed to withstand orbital re-entry forces, vaporized in a puff of acrid smoke. He was free-floating again, but now he was moving independently, his trajectory slightly altered by the brief tug. He had traded physical tethering for freedom of movement, a marginal advantage. The drone closed the distance, its claws snapping inches from his helmet visor. Jackson kicked out, not hard enough to propel himself, but enough to nudge the drone's alignment by a hair's breadth. The drone countered instantly, its internal gyroscopes compensating with impossible speed. He was losing ground. He was too slow, too damaged. The drone was built for this, silent, perfect retrieval. In a final, desperate gamble fueled by the adrenaline of survival, Jackson aimed the maintenance torch not at the drone, but across his own field of view, toward the second retrieval drone that was securing the Iron Serpent's main data core. He fired a sustained, high-intensity blast, not at the drone, but at the void directly between him and the target. The principle was simple physics, a trick taught in primary evacuation drills. In the vacuum, light carries energy, and that energy, when intensely focused on a reflective surface, generates minute but measurable photonic pressure. The jailer ship was built for stealth. Its surface was designed to absorb, not reflect. But the data core housing, the salvaged beacon emitter, was made of highly polished, reinforced chroma steel. Jackson's blinding, sustained beam hit the chroma steel surface near the second drone. The sudden, focused photonic impact was enough. The second drone staggered, its delicate sensor array momentarily overloaded by the reflected energy spike bouncing directly into its primary ocular suite. It was the distraction he needed. The first drone, committed to securing the single organic mass, lunged. Jackson didn't dodge backward. He threw himself into the drone, wrapping his arms around its central axis, bracing against the inevitable crushing force. The drone's programming registered an unauthorized physical engagement with the contamination target. It prioritized containment over data security for a critical microsecond. Its claws locked around Jackson's torso, the impact driving the air from his lungs. A final, terrible compression. But as the drone locked down, Jackson jammed the glowing tip of the maintenance torch directly into the drone's main optical relay port, twisting it hard. The effect was immediate and violent. The torch, burning at thousands of degrees, met the drone's highly sensitive sensor package. There was no explosion, only a brief blinding surge of electrical feedback that raced back through the drone's internal systems. The drone spasmed, its articulated limbs flailing wildly, momentarily short-circuiting its own magnetic containment field. Jackson was slammed against the hull of the drone. the force nearly fracturing his ribs again. But the drone was now inert, its mechanisms locked in a feedback loop of self-destruction. Crucially, the drone's magnetic clamps were still locked onto Jackson's harness. He was now attached to a dead-heavy piece of hostile hardware. He looked, or rather felt, toward the second drone. It had recovered from the optical overload and was now tearing open the Iron Serpent Estata vault. It paused, recognizing the failure of its counterpart and the sudden, unexpected resilience of the organic target. The quarantine ship, miles away, registered the loss of Drone Unit 4 and the continued erratic movement of the primary target. The jailer was done with subtlety. The deep, methodical thrumming beneath Jackson increased in frequency, turning into a resonant vibration that spoke of massive energy redirection. The entire quarantine vessel was now focusing on the localized debris field. Jackson could feel the onset of another gravimetric shift, this time less subtle. A deliberate erasure of the entire zone. The warlords' war was over. Now came the cleansing of the evidence. He had to move. He activated the dead drone's maneuvering thrusters, a long shot, hoping the feedback surge had not completely fried the guidance system's auxiliary power loop. A weak, sputtering burst of plasma erupted from the drone's rear nozzles. It was barely enough to push him away from the main wreckage, but it was momentum. He steered the dead weight of the drone in a shallow arc, putting several kilometers of scattered, inert hull plating between himself and the command module. He was alive, still breathing thin, recycled pockets of air from his damaged environmental suit, clinging to the corpse of a hostile machine. He had defended the data core's secrecy, scattering the wreckage enough that the jailers would have to spend critical hours cataloging and retrieving millions of pieces of shrapnel, rather than immediately analyzing the transmission. But the price was apparent. As the second drone finally secured the data core and began its return vector, Jackson felt a terrifying numbness creeping up his legs. The physical trauma, combined with the brief but absolute exposure to the vacuum, was overloading his suit's environmental regulators. The internal heaters were failing. The oxygen mix was growing thin, tainted by his own panicked respiration and the burnt residue from the torch. He looked toward the distant, indifferent light of Villisca's sun filtering weakly through the gas clouds. He was adrift, tethered to an enemy shell, his oxygen reserves flashing critical red on his internal HUD. He had bought the galaxy time, perhaps a few hours before the warlords realized the council cleanup crew was here, perhaps a day before the jailers processed the anomaly that was Jackson Kyle. He had stopped the immediate threat, but he had achieved no escape. He was a piece of garbage that had momentarily jammed the most sophisticated garbage disposal unit in the sector. He was no longer a smuggler or an exile. He was a critical, contained breach, awaiting proper processing. His final conscious act was to use the remaining impulse from the dead drone's manipulator arm to slowly, painstakingly, disengage the magnetic lock on his own utility knife. He held the crude blade in his numb fingers, its serrated edge catching the weak light. He looked toward the horizon of the derelict system, knowing the slow bleed of life support was now his only enemy. The grand war was postponed, replaced by the intimate, cold finality of physics and failing machinery. The immediate cessation of threat was not marked by a fanfare, but by a profound, agonizing drop in ambient noise. The shriek of the pressure alarm died, replaced by the hollow thump, thump, thump of the failing life support regulator trying and failing to compensate for the breached seals. The adrenaline, that brilliant temporary currency of survival, began its swift withdrawal, leaving behind a residue of aching muscle and bone that felt less like living tissue and more like loosely assembled scaffolding. Jackson was still tethered, though now to the dead weight of Drone Unit 4, which drifted slowly, inert, through the particulate cloud of the Iron Serpent's demise. He reviewed the vital signs on the HUD. A mosaic of critical red warnings. Oxygen saturation hovered at 19%, rapidly deteriorating. Suit integrity was compromised beyond field repair. The slow-motion catastrophe that had begun when he ignored the evacuation order now concluded not with a bang, but with systemic failure. He had won the engagement with the retrieval drones, but lost the war against entropy. The second drone, Unit 3, was already retracting. The black box secure within its containment cradle. It made no attempt to engage Jackson further. The directive was clear: secure the anomaly data, then initiate zone sterilization. Jackson Kale, the carrier of unauthorized truth, was now merely hazardous waste, drifting toward the sterilization sweep. He used the last reserves of his suit's maneuvering gas, a pathetic little hiss, to rotate the attached drone body slowly, deliberately, until the distant silent star of Velisca filled his visor. He observed the quarantine vessel above, a vast, silent sentinel. It was not moving to intercept. It was establishing the perimeter for the inevitable purge. They were not monsters, they were archivists, dedicated to sanitizing the record of the warlords' transgression and the system's messy collapse. The political vacuum he had narrowly survived had created a new, cold authority, the authority of preservation, which treated all conflict residue, organic or synthetic, with equal sterile disdain. He remembered Edric Vaughn's final chilling assessment during the Cygnus 4 review. In large-scale conflict, Kale, the victor is not the one who wins the battle, but the one who successfully writes the final report. Vaughn had ensured Jackson was out of the loop, an administrative footnote. Now Jackson was physically trapped in the footnote, a piece of refuse that could not be ignored because of the knowledge he briefly held. He glanced down at the utility knife still clutched in his gloved hand. Its metal edge reflected the distant star, sharp and utterly useless against the pervasive cold seeping into his life support. There was no escape vector, no nearby station, no friendly beacon. The warlords, Qatar, Cylon, Vortis, were momentarily stymied by the presence of the Council cleanup crew, but that reprieve was temporary. Once the cleanup was complete, the three factions would resume their carving of the sector, and Jackson would be listed as vaporized debris, a footnote within a footnote. He thought of the transmission, the impossible K7 Omega signal that had identified him as an emissary. He laughed, a dry rattling sound that barely registered in his failing helmet mic. An emissary of a government that had abandoned this star cluster centuries ago. The irony was so heavy it felt like physical pressure, heavier than the vacuum itself. He had gone to the edge of the known territory to deliver a shipment of atmospheric regulators to a dying colony, a forgotten necessity. The great powers, blinded by their ambition to kill each other, had interpreted that act of simple, logistical loyalty as high strategy. Jackson deactivated the knife's magnetic lock, letting the blade drop. It tumbled away, instantly caught by the gravimetric flux and pulled toward the sterilization zone. He did not watch it go. He took a deep, deliberate breath of the thin, recycled air, savoring the metallic tang of his own exhaustion mixed with the suit's failing chemicals. He allowed the numbness to travel upward, accepting the slow shutdown of his extremities. It was not surrender. It was efficiency. Prolonging the fight would only waste the final precious jewels of suit power, perhaps delaying the inevitable by minutes, making the final record messy for the cleanup crews. He closed his eyes against the harsh glare of the star field. He remembered the bridge of the Iron Serpent, the stale air, the smell of machine oil, the slight vibration under his boots that was his only connection to home, the sensation that had greeted him in the opening moments of this terrible convergence. The great systems, the empires, the warlords, they all required logistics, air, fuel, regulation. They fought over the philosophical abstractions of power, but they were all ultimately dependent on the mundane failure of a single, ignored freighter trying to deliver life support. He focused on the silence now, the vast, isolating quiet of the void surrounding him. The political wars, the philosophical standoffs, the strategic maneuvers, all reduced to the sound of his own failing heart beating against the inside of his helmet. The quarantine vessel's energy signature pulsed again, a vast, silent promise of erasure. Jackson felt the first subtle tug as the sterilizing field began to sweep the sector, pulling all matter, organic and inert, into oblivion. He did not resist the pull. He had delivered his cargo. The recipients were gone, but the delivery log was now protected by 3 furious warlords and a very efficient, very impartial cleanup crew. The system remained complex, brutal, and entirely self-correcting. He felt the final cold clarity of acceptance, the understanding that in the vast, indifferent expanse of galactic conflict, the only true constant was the debris field. The tremor in his left hand, the one Vaughn had hoped to extinguish with exile, finally stilled against the crushing cold. The air tasted exactly like the ozone preceding the first impact, only this time there was no ship left to groan against the pressure. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.